Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome three of our medicine chief residents today to present at Medicine Grand Rounds on virtual residency innovations in recruiting trainees in the COVID-19 era. This has been a challenge, and it's exciting to kind of recap and rethink some of the steps that we took during the past year. Let me just take a minute to introduce all three of the chief residents. They'll go in sequence. The first speaker will be Dr. Melton, who received her bachelor's degree from the University of Denver in biochemistry, MBA from the University of Denver, and her medical degree from the University of Colorado. She distinguished herself during her residency by focusing on preventative health measures in medically underserved populations, and also patient and family experiences in the perioperative period. Our second speaker is Dr. Rudofker. Dr. Rudofker received his bachelor's degree from the University of Richmond in music and business administration, and his medical degree from the University of Rochester. He distinguished himself during the residency program by focusing on myocardial infarction and critical limb ischemia, and focusing on how the description of these entities affected Medicare value reimbursement. Our third speaker is Dr. Daniel Gergen, who received his bachelor's degree from Johns Hopkins University, focused on public health, and his MD degree from Georgetown. He focused while at Georgetown on sleep patterns in children in the ICU, and during his residency program developed an ICU curriculum for third-year medical students. All three will be staying at the University of Colorado in fellowship programs. Dr. Gergen will be in the pulmonary fellowship program. Dr. Melton will be in the geriatrics fellowship program, and Dr. Rudofker will be in the cardiology fellowship program. I think that Dr. Melton is up first.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Schwartz, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today and allowing us to discuss something that has been evolving over the past year. Recruitment of the next wave of medical trainees is an essential process for all graduate medical education programs each year. From program directors to administrators to faculty who teach our trainees to residents and fellows, everyone plays a vital role in this process. When the COVID-19 pandemic began last year, it became apparent to us all that, as with many other aspects of our lives, both recruitment and medical education in our graduate medical education programs would have to change. As chief residents, we had the opportunity to be involved in this rapid innovation. And although we have interest in maintaining trainees who are high quality and well-rounded, we don't have any financial disclosures for this talk today. Using our internal medicine residency program as a model, today we're going to first start off by looking at what recruitment looked like prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll then follow an applicant through her journey this year, as well as the program, to highlight some of the key aspects of virtual recruitment and see how it went. And finally, we'll talk about the role of virtual recruitment moving forward. As we do this, we hope that you will imagine your role in the recruitment process and think about how this might have affected your role and how it may affect the future. And hopefully, if nothing else, we hope you leave with an appreciation for the magnitude of change that happened this year. Before we begin looking at virtual recruitment, we want to take a step back in time. This is to see where it all started. So this is the Colorado General Hospital back in 1940. And I want you to envision being a medical student back in the early 1900s. because at this point in time, the number of internship positions actually exceeded the number of medical students. And so hospitals entered into fierce competition for the top candidates. As a third-year medical student, or maybe even as early as a second-year medical student, you might have received a phone call from a hospital that offering you an internship position, and also asking you to accept on the spot or within the next few hours. As you can imagine, this pressure led many medical students to accept the position on the spot, fearing that they wouldn't have a better option later, and perhaps at the cost of being at an undesirable location or program. After several attempts for medical schools to advocate on behalf of their medical students, the National Residency Match Program, or NRMP, was developed in 1952 to create a centralized match process. Although it has undergone many iterations, it's developed on an algorithm using the concept of stable allocation, which later won its developers the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2012. So on the right here, you see Lloyd Shapley, who worked alongside David Gale, working on the theory of stable allocation and considering how you can use an algorithm to take the preferences of both parties into account for a match. On the left-hand side, you see Alvin Roth, who later saw that the work of Gale and Shapley was applicable to the medical market and helped try to optimize this. Although few people would say that this is flawless, it is the foundation on which our current recruitment process was developed. And it does allow medical students the ability to look at different options before they commit to a training program. So now we'll change gears, and we're going to look a little bit at what the interview process looked like for our past in-person interview days. So a medical student would receive an invitation to interview, and then they would promptly start making travel plans to actually visit for their interview day. Here at the University of Colorado, the interview day actually started the night before with a pre-interview dinner where they would go to a restaurant around town with house staff. And then the following day would look a bit like this. So from around 7 a.m. to 2:30 p.m., the day was packed full with interviews, meeting the residents, engaging in the noon conference with house staff, going on site tours, and understanding the details of the program. Some of the logistics from the 2019 season that we think are important to set the stage are that we hosted 14 interview days. We required 25 interviewers per day. We needed about 67 residents per day to be engaged in our dinners, in some of the panels that we had, into our tours and wrap-ups. This doesn't include those that attended our noon conferences. We hosted 56 interview dinners during the application season, and we interviewed 577 applicants. Maybe best of all is that we're known on the interview trail for the best bacon at breakfast. All right, so now that we have an idea of what the application season looked like in 2019, we're going to take a look at what that looked like what this year looked like for an applicant. So we're going to move to our case of a theoretical applicant, a lovely 29-year-old woman who's applying to internal medicine residency. And during the pandemic, she is on the East Coast at a well-known medical school. She has several accolades, including she completed her MPH prior to medical school. She did tutoring. She's had lots of work with the underserved populations. She's never been to Colorado before and has no family here, and her partner is not in medicine. She has competitive step scores, and she honored most of her clerkships, and her strong letters of recommendation reflect that hard work. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Rudofker to kind of talk us through what the applicants look like this year.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Melton. This is an excellent candidate, and we are certainly very glad that she applied here this year. 2020 was a really interesting year from an application standpoint, so I wanted to take a step back and look at the overall state of internal medicine residency applications. So here you're seeing this graph showing on the top line, the total number of applicants to internal medicine over the last 5 years. And on the bars below it, corresponding to the years, the number of applications submitted on average by each applicant. And what you can see is that there's both an increase in the number of applicants and the number of applications per applicant, leading to an exponential rise in the number of total applications submitted. A viewpoint from JAMA this past June claimed that somewhere between 7 and 21% of applicants across all specialties take up 50% of the interviews in this process. And that's problematic because with more applications, there's a fear that anyone less than the best candidates might need to apply to even more programs to secure enough interviews to match, thus creating this cycle of more and more and more applications. The authors of that viewpoint posit that with a virtual season this year, that this problem might actually exacerbate. And applying to 62 programs each seems even more crazy when you think about the match rates in internal medicine, which reach 90% when you're ranking 4 programs or more, and approach 100% when you rank 8, 9, 10 programs. So if it now requires that many applications to obtain enough interviews to match, then that's concerning because applications are expensive, interview travel is expensive, and it may exacerbate socioeconomic disparities. So with this year's exponential rise in applications, this may be an indication that this feared phenomena actually happen. But actually that graph doesn't tell the whole story. So if we look at that graph for only US allopathic MD graduates, which make up the majority of our residents, the increases in both applicants and applications per applicant were more subtle, with these students submitting just under 34 applications this past year compared to 32 last year. But when you look at DO students, whose match was combined with the allopathic NMRP match for the first time in 2020, although the number of applications has doubled over the last 5 years, they overall make up a small percentage of applicants, just 12% last year, although they do apply to significantly more programs compared to MD students. But when we look at this for IMG applicants, which stands for International Medical Graduates, this group not only accounted for more than half of all applicants, they make up the majority of overall applications, with each applying to an average of over 97 programs each. This group also seemed to react most strongly to the reduced geographic barriers to interviewing this year, as there was a sharp increase this year, and understandably so if you're living internationally. So whether there was an increasing share of interviews captured by a small number of top applicants isn't captured in that data. But it is worth noting that the idea of interview hoarding has been an issue across all specialties for some time. And there are a lot of different ideas proposed in the literature to help curb that. So now that we have a sense of where people are applying in internal medicine, let's look at who's applying to our program. So this is where applicants from our program came from in 2019, which is the last season that we did in-person interviewing. And we see that the majority of our applicants come from the Midwestern region, making up 26%, with 15% in the Northeast, 10% on the West Coast, and 2% coming from our home institution. Notably, 14% of our applications last year came from international students. When we compare that to this year, there isn't a whole lot of big changes, although we did see a big increase in the IMG applicants, making up now 21% of our total applications, and a significant decrease in applications coming from the Midwest, which dropped 5%. We did see slightly increased applications coming from regions further away from us, like the Northeast and the West Coast, although not on a statistically significant level. So now that we know where our applicants are coming from, let's look at who they are. In 2019, about 41% of our application pool identified as Women, as you would have expected, we had the same breakdown amongst this past year's applications. Then we look at measures of applicant strength. And we know that board scores alone are very poor predictors of resident performance. And as a program, we commit to judging applicants in a holistic manner. The majority of applications that come to us have their entire application reviewed, and we assign them what's called a holistic review score, which is created in order to standardize our review process and also minimize bias in that process. So the score does take into account the more traditional metrics like board scores or review or our AOA, but it also awards points for a number of factors, including your research accomplishments and your life experiences. The total scores are then added up for each applicant and can help guide which applications we end up inviting to interview with us. Interestingly, this past year saw a significant decrease in the average score compared to the year prior. This is hard to draw conclusions from, but it may fit with the notion that applicants with traditionally lower match rates, like DO students and IMGs, significantly increased how many programs they applied to this year, as I showed previously, while US MD graduates, which match at higher rates, didn't do so in a dramatic way. One very important characteristic that we pay attention to is the percentage of applicants that identify as from groups underrepresented in medicine, or URM, which the AAMC defines as applicants from backgrounds that are underrepresented in the medical profession relative to the general population. Amongst our applicant pool, the percentage identifying as URM is overall low, 11%. For comparison, in Adams County, where most of us are right now, 22% of residents identify as Latino and 5% identify as Black or African American. So while we're glad this number didn't decrease with the virtual application season, it overall remains low. This breakdown was of particular interest to us this year, as like many programs, we wondered what impact virtual interview season might have on our ability to recruit diverse applicants from a variety of backgrounds. Video interviews can both promote and mitigate bias in the recruitment process. By eliminating the need to travel here, virtual interviews can even the socioeconomic playing field for applicants with limited financial resources or family responsibilities, for example. But on the other hand, we know that the broadband digital divide negatively impacts minority households and may raise barriers in other ways. The impacts of this haven't been studied on a large scale, but we can all agree that Zoom interviews are hard. We're all familiar with the concept of Zoom fatigue at this point as we sit here on a Zoom conference today, and have probably experienced that having a Zoom interview or a Zoom conversation requires a higher cognitive burden than an in-person. The lay press and to a lesser degree, the medical literature has caught on to this and has started to explore why our brains have so much more trouble communicating on Zoom. And all these sources agree that we have increased difficulty interpreting social cues. Our brains have to work harder when we don't have nonverbal communication to rely on. Marvin et al. Hypothesized that with this higher cognitive burden, we're potentially more susceptible to relying on heuristics and implicit associations during our interviews, which could introduce bias into the scoring. They propose that programs take steps to mitigate bias in the interview process, including a holistic review process, using standardized interview questions, and ensuring that faculty that are from URM are part of the review and interview process. Our program was able to adopt all of these recommendations this year, and additionally, we had all of our interviewers undergo implicit bias training. Our APD for Diversity, Equity, and Justice reviewed all of the URM applications after the first pass to ensure that the scoring was equitable, as well as we offered a virtual second look day specifically to URM interviewees to offer additional opportunities to get to know our program. Now, I mentioned the socioeconomic playing field with interviews, and it's really important to highlight the significant financial impact that this virtual interviewing has had on applicants as well. So thinking back to our case applicant, who's from the East Coast, if she applied to an average of 34 programs, that would cost her $544 in ERAS fees, which is the application service, $80 in her USMLE transcript for her step scores, even though she has all the score reports, $85 just to register to submit a rank list, totaling $709 before she even does her first interview. Prior to this year, she would have had to fly into Colorado using a very conservative estimate of $300. She may have spent $50 on transportation to and from the airport, maybe $125 for a hotel on average, getting a special rate, and maybe $50 in food and drink, all totaling just under $500 for each interview. We know that in internal medicine, applicants interview at an average of 12 to 13 programs. So a total of $5,700 in addition to the initial $700 is a pretty conservative estimate. While costs range for these things and there's a general lack of data available to back these claims, we assume that some students might even take on additional loans for this expense, which again may exacerbate socioeconomic disparities in medicine. We also know that 3/4 of students graduate with an average of over $200,000 in debt. And while the interview costs as a percentage of debt are relatively small, it adds more to an already very heavy burden. So with that background in mind, we're going to offer our case applicant an interview, and fortunately, she accepted. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gergen to talk about what our case applicant may experience on her virtual interview day.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Rudofker. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the biggest challenges our residency program faced was how do we transition all of our educational mission and curriculum to the virtual format? One of the ways we did that as chief residents was by trying new and innovative approaches to our noon conferences. And one of those approaches was the digital whiteboard, which you're looking at now, and which we're going to do the next portion of this talk on. So one of the biggest challenges in virtual recruitment was how do we convey program culture? During the in-person recruitment season, applicants can have dinners with our residents before the interview, they see our residents throughout the day, and they have a wrap-up session at the end of the day with our residents where they can talk more and get any quick questions answered. And so essentially, how do we recreate that virtually? So essentially, we took a 4-step approach: an interview website, our social media presence, a pre-interview Zoom Hangout, and noon conference. So let's go through each of these one by one. The first thing we're going to look at is our pre-interview website. This website was created by my co-chiefs prior to the interview season, and this is the first time as a program we've ever offered an additional website just for applicants in addition to our regular internal medicine website. Applicants received the link to this website the day they got their invitation to interview at Colorado. On this first page, we've got a welcome video from Dr. Connors, a video about internal medicine here, a really cool video that follows 4 of our residents throughout their day, and then a big picture video about GME. So overall, big programmatic stuff. On the second page here, we've got the virtual interview day schedule. And so as you can see, this schedule looks pretty similar to what Dr. Melton showed at the beginning of the talk. The recruitment day runs from about 7:45 to 1:15 in the afternoon and has 2 interviews. Where this website really shines, though, is this page, the answers from Colorado. So here we asked our residents to essentially answer common questions that applicants ask during the pre-interview dinners or during the interview day itself. Our COVID spin was that we asked them to take those answers and film them across Colorado. Questions like, what's your favorite part of residency? What if you're not outdoorsy? What's the 4+4 schedule like? How's the Denver food and drink scene? Where do people live? What's the driving and parking situation like? Importantly, is lunch provided? Definitely more important, what's research like? What's couples matching like? Do residents hang out? And what are our hospital systems like? So overall, these are just really cool individualized videos created by our residents. Next, we have our diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice page in which we feature our pledge to commit to those qualities. And then we've got links to our Minority and Allied Residency Counselor, Mark, and more of the Medicine Committee. If we keep going, we've got track-specific pages. So we have a track for our categorical, primary care, hospitalist, and physician scientist. And then we have a clinic sites page in which we have short blurbs, which sort of highlight the things that are really unique about each of our continuity clinic sites, where applicants will spend their 3 years if they match here. Next, because everything was here, we've got a second look page in which we offered applicants the chance to see our Wednesday education sessions, or WES, journal clubs, faculty panels, social events, all stuff that we just could not do in years past. Next, we've got our social media page, which we'll talk more about in a second. And finally, if any questions remained unanswered at the end of the interview day or the interview season, we gave contact information for a bunch of residents, and applicants could reach out at any point. So how did we do in creating a website? So after each interview day, we sent all of the applicants a post-interview survey, and we got about 300 responses. And one of those questions was, how satisfied were you with the content provided on the interview day webpage? And overall, 95% of applicants said they were satisfied with the content. Perhaps more importantly, almost everyone was using the webpage, with very few exceptions. The next thing we looked at was our social media presence. And I'll say overall, this is a largely data-free zone. The only real article that we could find in the peer review literature was an article from Academic Medicine in 2017 that looked at all of the previously published data on social media and graduate medical education. They identified 27 articles, only 6 of which pertained to social media and recruitment. And of those, there were only 2 articles that even looked at the applicant approach to social media. To give you a flavor for what those 2 articles showed, the most recent was 2013. And in 2013, it was estimated that about 30% of applicants utilized social media when deciding whether or not to apply or rank a specific program. We can guess that in the year since 2013, that number is probably higher based on the rise of social media and the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, this is a largely data-free zone. So how did we utilize social media during this virtual interview season? So one of the ways we utilized social media was by giving our residents control of our program Instagram account. We essentially gave them control, and they created day in the life posts. It's a collection of content collated together to basically walk someone through a person's life. So this is Dante Mesa, one of our second-year residents, and I'm just going to go ahead and play his clip from his day in the life video. And the reason this was great is it allowed our residents to directly interact with residents without ever meeting them in person. Applicants could ask our residents any questions. They could ask them questions about sites, about patients we see, about what they do outside of work, like Grey's Anatomy. What's rheumatology clinic like? What's your match rate like? And this is the first time we've ever really made a concerted effort to reach out on social media. Another example of what this looked like. Here's another day in the life clip from Meryl Colton, another one of our second-year residents. And then again, you can see something pretty similar. Meryl introduces herself, and then for the rest of the day, she's putting content on Instagram showing who she is, what we do on a daily basis, and more importantly, just how cool it is to be a resident here, how much fun it is, and sort of what your life could theoretically look like if you matched at Colorado. The next thing we did was we looked at our pre-interview hangouts. So like I said, this year, this took place of the pre-interview dinner. And of course, it had to happen on Zoom. And so for our pre-interview hangouts, these happened before every single virtual interview day. They were 1 hour in length. And overall, we had about 40 to 50 applicants per interview, plus about 12 residents. So overall, once we put people in the breakout rooms, we had a 4-to-1 applicant to resident ratio. So again, by breaking people up, we gave residents and applicants the chance to interact in a more personal setting. The other cool thing about this is we could individualize it based on the interview day. So we had a primary care specific day, we had a hospitalist day, and we had categorical days. And so we were able to really personalize that pre-interview Zoom hangout. Again, how did we actually do in that pre-interview Zoom hangout? So going back to that post-interview survey, we asked, how satisfied were you with that night before? And overall, about 85% of applicants said they were satisfied with the night before hangout. Notably, about 5% of applicants said they weren't able to attend for various reasons, but overall, people were satisfied. Finally, we looked at our noon conferences. So throughout the year, my co-chiefs and I have been trialing sort of new and innovative ways to improve upon the tried and true medicine noon conference format. And this year, during our recruitment season, we asked our applicants and our residents to participate in one of these virtual conferences. So for these conferences, we had generally 4 to 5 residents being case discussants and walking through a case from start to finish. So on the right side of the screen here, you'll see the Zoom boxes for 4 of our residents. You see Dr. Connors, and these residents are going to walk through the case from chief concern all the way to final diagnosis. So for the next 45 seconds, let's watch one of these recruitment conferences from start to finish. So as you can see, our residents start at the HPI and then just go from there. This is a really cool process in our opinion, because it really shows just how collaborative our residents are and how smart they are and how good their clinical reasoning is. As you can see, they talk about teaching points they may have picked up on wards or from a specialist. They talk through how they think about each piece of data, what the differential is, what their working theories are. This lets us also pull in the applicants themselves via the chat feature or just chiming in. It also lets us utilize the knowledge of our expert discussants, for example, Dr. Connors or Dr. Albert or Dr. Chan, and for them to weigh in on the case. We also can switch back and forth and show imaging. And then ultimately, because our residents are so good at what they do, by the end of the case, they always come to the right conclusion. In this case, GPA complicated by an abscess. The other way that we approach noon conferences was via the digital whiteboard, which is what we're using now. So shown is another example of a case that we walked through. In this case, it was empyema necessitans. And from start to finish, our residents walk through. And as a chief resident, we diagram their thought process, what they think's going on, teaching points, etc. In addition, throughout the year, we've been posting these conferences to our program's YouTube channel. And so what this allows is for our residents on nights to watch conferences from during the day, but it also allows our applicants to go essentially check, hey, is this what this actually looks like when I'm not interviewing? And so if an applicant was interested, they could come to our YouTube page. And at this point, we've got about 75 different conferences that we've posted throughout the year. And so, at any point, an applicant could look and say, hey, is this really what they're like? Is this really how good they are at clinical reasoning? And the answer is yes. So how did we do in terms of noon conference? Going back to that survey, we asked people, how helpful was that? And overall, about 90% of applicants said that attending noon conference was helpful, which is sort of exactly what we wanted to see when transitioning over to the virtual format. Last but not least, the biggest question, how did we actually do overall when we interviewed? And so for that, we asked them as a final question, how satisfied were you with your virtual interview day? And overall, 99% of applicants said they were satisfied with the virtual interview day, which is great. That's sort of, again, exactly what we wanted to see. So if we take a step back, we conveyed culture in the virtual format by creating an interview website, creating a more robust social media presence, transitioning our pre-interview dinners to Zoom Hangouts, and then really trying to revitalize and sort of change the way we approach noon conference as chief residents. And with that, I'm going to transition back to Dr. Melton, who's going to talk about recruitment from the program perspective.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we've seen now a little bit about the applicants and the applicant perspective, but of course, we also want to know about the program's perspective. So Dr. Gergen will pull back our digital whiteboard again here. Great. So we'll move on to case number 2, which is our program. So we are an internal medicine program. We're always trying to recruit an exceptional and diverse intern class. And we have a long-standing history of successful in-person recruitment, but we're undergoing our first ever virtual recruitment season during the pandemic and have to figure out how to make this happen. So the first thing we want to do is to look back at some of these logistics. So these are the logistics from the 2019-2020 interview season. With virtual recruitment, we actually decreased our interview days from 14 to 12. We maintained 25 interviewers per day, and each interviewer actually did an additional interview each day. Instead of requiring 67 residents per day, we actually needed about 17 on deck each day. Again, not including those who were involved in our new conferences, but these were the ones who helped with our pre-interview hangouts, some of our panels, and our social media. Rather than having 56 interview dinners, we had 12 pre-interview hangouts that were our virtual format. And we were able to interview 658 applicants this year. You may wonder why the number of applicants interviewed increased. Primarily because there was some uncertainty as to whether or not top candidates would interview at more programs this year. And so we increased the number of applicants we interviewed to make sure we had a large enough pool, which ultimately we probably didn't need to do. All right, and so one of the biggest elephants in the room is, what was the cost of this virtual interview season? So in the 2019-2020 interview season, we spent about, our program spent about $78,000 on recruitment efforts. Now, most of that came down to food and transportation support, also some more minor expenditures like supplies and things like that. And so thinking about the fact that most of that was travel and food, in the 2020-21 application year, we spent about $100 on our website, and conservatively we'll add another $100 for some other supplies. So we're thinking we might have spent around $200 on these efforts. That's a pretty significant difference that we see, and leaves us with some potential room for reinvesting in other areas, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gergen to talk about the perspectives from our program leadership.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Melton. So, it's important to us what our faculty and our program leadership think about the virtual interview process. So we asked our program leadership for their perspective on the virtual interview season, specifically what they perceived as the strengths and what they perceived as the weaknesses. So here's a quote from one of our APDs, that the virtual interview process provided a tremendous amount of flexibility around scheduling and logistics. In the past, trying to get literally hundreds of busy faculty members to leave what they were doing and travel to one of our interview sites in person was a huge challenge, which I think anyone who's ever assisted us in interviewing can attest to. Next, having the flexibility to do an interview at an office, at work, or at home was a tremendous advantage. Again, very similar, flexibility and logistics. Next, convenience for all parties. Candidates could interview more places and we could interview more candidates. Like Dr. Melton just mentioned, that was largely out of a concern based on interview inflation, that we weren't sure who was actually going to be interested in coming here. And then last, for the primary care track, we offered applicants a lot of virtual second look opportunities, which I think gave them a unique chance to drop in and see Journal Club, a West session, a social activity, and other elements of the program they wouldn't normally be able to see. And this was a huge benefit to the virtual format. We did things this year that we just could not do in years past because we just could not ask people to come back for that much time. Next, let's transition to the weaknesses. So again, one of our APDs said there is still something lost in terms of getting to know someone with the virtual format. Body language, visual cues, social appropriateness, and social interactions are of tremendous importance in trying to assess an applicant during the interview, and that was lost with the virtual format. Next, we may have missed out on valuable information gleaned about candidates outside of the interview itself. So how do those residents interact, or how those applicants interact with our residents during the day? And also importantly for the applicant, do they see themselves fitting into our program? Do they like the people they meet? Is this somewhere they could train? And finally, the biggest weakness is not able to see the residents interact in more informal ways. Like I mentioned, we tried to recreate this by conveying our program culture, but of course, there will never be anything like traveling out here and seeing and meeting all of our amazing residents in person. So if we zoom back out, at this point, we've talked about the applicant perspective, geography and application, how we tried to convey program culture, and what the interview season looked like from the program perspective. So next, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Rudofker to answer the important question, how did we match? And who will be joining us to start their training in July?
Thanks, Dr. Gergen. So here is announcing our 2020-2021 match class. Overall, to summarize this year's match, we were thrilled about our match results. The number of ranks that we required to fill our class was within the same range as we've seen over the last few years, which refutes the fear that we would have seen wide-scale interview hoarding by top candidates. While we have a number of one-year preliminary positions, and we were very happy with our match for that track, for the purpose of this discussion, I'll focus on the 53-year residents that we matched. So first, looking at where our match class came from, we're very pleased to see our class coming from a variety of regions with a nice distribution along the East Coast, a higher number of applicants matched from the Pacific Northwest, and a stable number from our home institution here. And we were even happy to have one international applicant from Brazil as well. If you compare this to last year's, the map overall looks pretty similar, with maybe a higher concentration in the Midwest, but no statistically significant changes in where our matched class came from. Looking at them side by side, I think maybe a notable increase is the interns coming from the Northeast and the West, although again, not statistically significant when compared in a chi-square test. About over half of our match class was women this year, which is very similar to last year, which we were pleased about. And then looking at our holistic review score that I mentioned previously, although the scores were lower for overall applicants this year compared to last, amongst our match class, there was not a significant difference between the two. So we're very excited. Our match class boasts a very impressive set of research and life experiences, as well as board scores, et cetera. And lastly, we were thrilled that 18% of our intern class comes from URM groups, which we were very happy about. So with that, I will turn it to Dr. Melton to wrap up our discussion.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so today we have taken you through an applicant perspective, both from the pre-pandemic and during this virtual recruitment year. And looking at some of the data that we've been able to gather and analyze, we have a few conclusions that we think we can make. First off was, as Dr. Rudofker just showed us, by transitioning to this virtual platform, we were still able to recruit a match class with similar diversity with respect to geography, those underrepresented in medicine, as well as gender, as well as applicant strength with respect to our holistic scoring system. And some of this we, judging by our surveys and by this strong match, we think that part of this was driven by our resident-driven interactive resources, which we feel helped convey program culture in a time period when we couldn't have our applicants visit us and understand how wonderful Colorado is. And finally, we were able to show that we had significant cost savings to both applicants and the program through this virtual format. From a program perspective, that leaves funds that are potentially be reinvested. And from an applicant standpoint, this potentially minimized some of the socioeconomic barriers that have prevented applicants from applying to our program in the past. Dr. Gergen will now talk about some of the challenges that we still see with this format.
Thank you, Dr. Melton. So the first challenge is that recruiting a diverse applicant pool remains a challenge. While it's undeniably a good thing that we were able to maintain diversity, the 18% number that Dr. Rudofker mentioned, we all agree that for our program to truly take the next step and truly be exceptional, that number needs to be higher. How do we get there? One possible avenue is reinvesting some of the money saved in the virtual interview process into various things. For instance, is there any way that we could reinvest that money to encourage away rotations for students from historically underrepresented schools at Colorado? For this coming interview season, is there a way to reinvest that money to bolster our social programming and our outreach, both before and during the interview season? But that's certainly something that needs to be improved upon. Second is that there's uncertainty about application inflation moving forward as well. So, I think it's difficult to predict what's going to happen in the years ahead. Are we going to see the MD and DO numbers plateau? Will the IMG numbers keep going up? It's tough to say. But the concern is that when we interview and when we decide who we want to rank, how do we know whether someone's truly interested in Colorado, or are they interviewing with us because they feel like they need to meet that number needed to match criteria? And last, non-uniformity in interview formats may create inequities. In our opinion, the worst case scenario here is that in the future, some programs go back to in-person interviewing while some continue virtual interviewing. And for this process to truly work and to truly be equitable, it has to be uniform across. There can't be some places doing one thing and other places doing another thing. So finally, this talk would not have been possible with an amazing number of people, and we just wanted to thank a few in particular. First, our program administration and coordination. Jennifer Weber's our program administrator and does so many things on a daily basis and was so helpful in helping us put this talk together. Next, Ellie Herner, who was our recruitment coordinator. Ellie truly kept this entire operation afloat throughout the interview season. Her abilities to coordinate and keep interviews running smoothly was truly amazing. We could not be any more appreciative for her help. Then the rest of our program administration and coordination team. Next, we'd like to thank our program leadership, Dr. Connors, as well as all of our APDs. They are the reason our program is truly an exceptional place to train. And finally, our co-chief residents, Drs. Bowman, Shaw, Treflick, and McGee, for all of their tireless help throughout the year. And then last, but certainly not least, all of our house staff. We cannot thank you guys enough for creating videos, participating in our conferences, and connecting with applicants before, after the interview season. In talking to applicants, the reason so many of them ranked us so highly is because of all of your efforts and because how amazing all of you are to work with on a daily basis. So thank you. And with that, thank you, Dr. Schwartz, as well, for the opportunity to speak today. And we look forward to answering any of your questions.
Okay. Well, let me start off by congratulating the three of you and the program as a whole in terms of the huge effort that was undertaken and the new programs that were developed to reach out in different ways and to interview individuals in different ways and to provide a fair interview process and a level playing field for all of our applicants. So congratulations. Let me just ask the very simple question: how was this effort organized? Was this a grassroots effort? Was this top down? Did you meet somewhere in between? How did you come up with these different approaches and decide what you were going to change and what you were going to offer?
I think I can take that one. Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Schwartz. We had developed a committee within our program leadership to deal with what we just called future state when COVID started. And around June, we started to really try and imagine the future state of our virtual interview season. I think a few of these innovations came out of that committee and just making these a reality. I think a lot of the culture innovations, like our social media page, really came from our residents in a more grassroots style. Our YouTube and noon conference format came from our chiefs. So it was really a combination of all of those things. Everyone had great ideas of how to make this, how to overcome the challenges of a virtual recruitment season, and everything worked to get together seamlessly to our advantage.
Any other comments on the organizational effort? No. Okay, tell us a little bit of what our competition looks like. What did other places do? Are there extremes, programs that didn't do anything in terms of creating new platforms and other programs that may have exceeded what we did here?
I think I can speak to the educational component of that. I think as a whole, as our chief group and as a program leadership group, we were ahead of the curve in terms of transitioning to more digital recruitment conferences and just generally sort of more innovative noon conferences as a whole. Of course, I can't speak for all programs across the country, but from colleagues I've had at other sites, they were still doing the sort of old time PowerPoint, clicking through slides, pausing for questions. And we got away from that pretty early in the year. And so I think from that perspective, in talking to applicants and seeing some of the narrative comments in our surveys, we had a pretty unique interview day overall. And a large portion of that was the panels and then the actual noon conference portion of it.
I think that, several of our chiefs at least have been on other fellowship interviews to see what the interview process looked like from that standpoint as well. And we also can monitor what other groups are doing on their social media. So we know that, our Colorado Med Peds program had like tons of stuff, which was awesome. And pediatric programs were following in suit. And you could see that other programs didn't have as robust of a social media presence. Although none of us actually interviewed for residency at any of these other sites, that's kind of how we kept the pulse for what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just starting to see some of these experiences published in the literature. There was something recently published about using a unique educational software to deliver a curriculum to one program's residents. So I imagine that other programs will start publishing their experience of how they adapted.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask, what would you change? What are the things that you might de-emphasize, and what areas would you like to see this grow in next year? No takers, huh?
I think I think in building this talk, I think one of our experiences is that the applicants really appreciate all of the pre-work that goes into it. The website, the social media presence. I think between us, we think that's all probably a little bit more important than the pre-interview hangout. In some ways, the pre-interview hangout felt like a box to check for applicants on occasion. Whereas if we do our job and create a robust website and the social media is on point, a lot of those questions are answered and applicants already have a feel for our program before they even get here. And so I think going forward, I would emphasize the website, the social media presence, and then the stuff on interview day, perhaps de-emphasizing the pre-interview hangout a little bit. Not to say I would get rid of it, but I think it is less important when compared to the other three.
Another thing that we did this year were some of the second look events, and I think there's opportunity to do more with that. We invited people to some of the things that were already happening on campus. We did have a diversity and inclusion day that was specifically focused on some of the URM candidates. But I think that's another area where we can think a little bit more about how that went, and something that we didn't really capture much data on, like how the applicants liked it, what they, if they felt it was necessary. So I think working a little bit more around that would also be helpful. I mean, we even had some of the primary care track residents join us for a virtual cooking class. And that's really cool, but we just don't know quite how that impacted everyone's decisions.
And I have to agree with all this. I think the things that really highlight our program culture are worth emphasizing and investing into the future. I mean, when we reflect on our experience choosing a residency, a lot of it is a feeling that and you get almost, instantaneously, a program's going to be in your top 5 at least. And so how do we give that feeling off through a computer screen? It's really all those resources that Dr. Gergen mentioned that I think we should really focus on and expand going forward. And I think that goes for whether we're in person or virtual.
So great, Eric, you kind of bridged the next question, which is, imagine the future without a pandemic or without COVID and with complete unrestricted travel. What do you think the interview process is going to look like? And what elements of this are we going to just carry forward as part of our interview process and maybe offer individuals the opportunity to interview remotely as an embedded part of our application process?
I think you're asking us the question that everyone has. It sounds like people that have been going to some of these conferences recently are just, what are we going to do next? And I think that's the reason why we wanted to share this information with everyone here and hopefully with other programs. I think one thing that Dr. Gergen brought up in our challenges is that if there's not uniformity across programs, it could really lead to some kind of inequities with who we end up matching and our candidates. And so it seems to us that there almost needs to be a all virtual or and all that revert back to what we did before. I think some of the things we showed today, like the cost savings to both applicants in the program, are pretty significant and do make an argument for potentially continuing this long term.
And I think the other really difficult question here is there a hybrid possibility? And I think it's difficult to imagine a scenario where we offer virtual interviews, but then an in-person second look and not have that create additional disparities in the ranking process. I think, we would like to consider that we won't have any bias in that decision, but I think naturally as people, we're all bound to think more highly of the people that we meet in person as opposed to people that we're only able to meet via Zoom. And so I think going forward, if we do go the virtual format, it almost certainly has to be an entirely virtual format with virtual second look opportunities like we did this year to avoid some of those innate disparities.
Or to use the cost savings to pay for the second visits.
Exactly. Yeah. Or to reinvest some of that money to make sure that we are being very conscious about avoiding disparities.
Yeah. What about organizations like AIM? Are there organizations that are coming out and giving guidance in terms of how interviews could be done, should be done to level the playing field across the different house staff training programs?
Our understanding is that at the recent APDIM meeting, which is the Association for Program Directors in Internal Medicine, there were discussions of calling for a virtual recruitment season again, or there was some discussion or debate about it. That seems to be the leaning of that organization. But to our knowledge, we don't know of any other calls from major groups to continue virtual interviewing. It may be worth mentioning also that the AAMC has set up a virtual interviewing pilots in the past. They've done this with, I believe, urology and emergency medicine using a standardized video interview as a general application to a program. It showed that those interviews were successful, but in judging applicants, but were unpopular among the applicants themselves, probably because their peers were flying around the country, getting to see places in person.
So there's still quite a bit of concern about attractiveness of our program to underrepresented minorities. I was wondering if you could talk about the challenges and also potential approaches that you might take to improve that. You did mention a couple in terms of reinvestment dollars. Just could you expand on that? I think Dr. Melton, you referred to a few of those opportunities.
Yeah. So I think, I think it's a good question. I think we're just now getting some of that data back from our post-interview surveys and a much larger, more robust survey that sort of asks applicants what they think about our program and the interview process. And I think from that, we can look into why do people that identify as an underrepresented minority not apply here or not rank us as highly. And I think that's a starting point. I think, promoting away rotations for students that are underrepresented is key. I think getting students to see our program in person for up to a month would be amazing. And, I think there's a trickle down effect there. If a student does a rotation and loves it and then goes back to their medical school and sort of promotes us and says, hey, this was a great place. You guys should do this in the future. Or you all should do this in the future. I think that's really beneficial. And so I think that's one avenue. And I think, again, it's sort of a broader program thing is that residents want to train in a place where they feel accepted. And so across all fellowships, all residencies, and sort of all faculty members, sort of along that broader mission, how do we keep working to make the faculty and the residency as representative of the community we practice in as possible? I don't think there's an easy answer for that now, but that's sort of the longer term goal.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
I think it also starts at the medical school admissions process as well. We know that that medical students across the country do a relatively poor job of making up the ethnic and racial groups of the nation at large. And so this really starts in making medical school more accessible to everyone. The price of medical school is a potential driver of that. But I think there are a lot of complex reasons why that is. It is trending in a right direction. The difference is from 2010 to 2012 versus 2017. There was a study published in JAMA that examined that, showed a reduction in the differences between the population's makeup and medical students' makeup. However, there's still a lot of room to go.
Dr. Melton, you were going to say something.
No, I agree with the, thinking about it system-wide from the medical student standpoint up. And the only thing is, I think along with what we proposed with the having people come for more of the acting internships and maybe using some of the funds to support that, we have in the past used funds to support some of the underrepresented groups to come for our second look days through travel expenses, et cetera. And I'm not sure what the return on investment for that was. So it's hard to know if you have people come, are they more likely to end up coming? I think having them come for a month at a time may be where we get more bang for our buck.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for this terrific discussion. But more importantly, I want to congratulate all of you, your peers, the leadership in the house staff training program and the staff of the house staff training program in pulling off an amazing feat and developing a program that has attracted really superb individuals to our program. So congratulations, job well done.
Thanks, Dr. Schwartz. Thanks for having us today.